My first argument: migrants are people who move from their country of usual residence or nationality to another country. A migrant may move for economic or other reasons, to flee from natural disasters caused by climate change, or to escape persecution, human rights abuses, threats to life or physical integrity, war, and civil unrest. There are three main categories of migrants: the regular migrants, the undocumented migrants, and other migrants in need of protection, such as stateless persons, victims of trafficking, unaccompanied children, and failed asylum seekers, who are also seeking protection under international law. In 2009, the total number of international migrants was estimated in 213 million people, or 3.1% of the world population. These are the data of United Nations Development Programme. The International Labour Organization has established that around 90% of them are composed of active economic migrants and members of their family, and that only about 7 or 8 were refugees or asylum seekers. Then the above distinctions, refugees, migrants, are not strict and invariable. At the same time, a migrant may fall into two categories, for instance, asylum seeker and victim of trafficking, or change from one category to another, undocumented migrant in country A and asylum seeker in country B. Then my first conclusion is that religious leaders have a role to play for all the migrants and refugees, because their distinction according to international law is not strict, and also because the migrants are the 90% of the people moving from one country to another, and only 8% are refugees. It is true that the European continent has for some years been facing increased pressure from migration. According again to United Nations Development Programme, in 2010, Europe was expected to host the largest number of migrants in comparison with other continents, namely 69.8 million migrants, representing the 32% of the total flow of migrants. In 2000, only one decade ago, Europe was again the world's largest host region for migrants, with 56 million people, representing again the 32.1% of total arrivals. This is the reason why I will concentrate my next two arguments to European legal order and the responsibilities of religious leaders according to this order. Then, according to European Court of Human Rights, or Strasbourg Court, one of the basic elements of European democracy concerns the peaceful coexistence of different religions or other political, social communities. In order to be compatible with democratic society, any restrictive measure of human rights should contribute decisively to social peace. I quote from a Bulgarian judgment of Court of Justice of Strasbourg: in democratic societies in which several religions coexist within one and the same population, it may be necessary to place restriction on this freedom in order to reconcile the interests of the various groups and ensure that everyone's beliefs are respected. May I give two more examples from the case law of Strasbourg? Politically main beliefs, fascism, Nazism, racism, or communism in the old days, that are opposed to Western liberal democracy, European Western liberal democracy, are not protected from the European Convention of Human Rights. The Court has pointed out that any of these ideas are out of the context of a democratic society because they are incompatible with human dignity. In addition, they must not conflict with the fundamental rights of the individual. Although this delimitation, democratic, non-democratic beliefs, was established in the Cold War environment, it is today the dominating perception. The attitude against fundamentalist political parties confirms the distinction of beliefs. The European Convention of Human Rights protects religious, philosophical, or other beliefs which do not go against the content of the democratic society. But also, in a democratic society, in a European democratic society, the citizen's duty in a representative, pluralistic democracy cannot be linked to whatever way of revealing his beliefs, especially if there is a danger for the peaceful coexistence in the European societies. On the occasion of the application concerning the mention of religion on Greek identity cards, the Court pointed out that religious beliefs do not constitute information that can be used to distinguish an individual citizen in his relation with the state. Not only they are a matter of individual consent, but may also, like other information, change over a person's lifetime. Moreover, recording them in a document exposes the barriers to the risk of the discriminatory situation in their relations with the administrative authorities or even their professional relations. The justification of European persistence to pluralism is the European history. The protection of pluralism has long been indispensable for the peaceful coexistence of European people. Having a bitter experience from the religious disputes of the distant past, European states wished, after the end of the Second World War, to safeguard peaceful coexistence between various religious or other groups. Finally, my last point is that the religious leaders have the legal obligation to guarantee the peaceful coexistence in a particular society. Otherwise, their European protection will be suspended. In the famous welfare party, Refah Partisi, the European Court of Human Rights, sitting as a grand chamber plenary, considered that, I quote, Refah's proposal that there should be a plurality of legal systems will introduce into all legal relationships a distinction between individuals grounded on religion, will categorize everyone according to his religious belief, and would allow him rights and freedoms not as an individual, but according to his allegiance to a religious movement. Consequently, every European state has to be a guarantor of the rights and freedoms of individuals, all the individuals in its territory, because it will be itself the source of violation, since it will make distinctions that are not in accordance with the European Court of Human Rights. At the same time, the European Court asserts that the fundamental principle of Islamic law is unity of thought, which does not allow any other direction. Therefore, only faithful Muslims will enjoy their rights and freedoms. The others, either by law or by the circumstances, will be compelled to act contrary to their beliefs. Finally, jihad will also be employed in order to achieve welfare parties' aims, a point running contrary to the declared position of the Court that the means to realize political aims should be in all respects legal and democratic. It is true that the Court position in Refah Partisi is absolutely compatible with the position also of the political organ of the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly. The representatives, the members of this assembly, have recently underlined that the religious communities ought not to replace democratic running and not to aim at political power, respecting the definition of the rights of the individual contained in the European Convention of Human Rights, as well as law supremacy. They also related today's problem in society to fundamentalist intolerant movements and condemned extremism that constitutes, as it is characteristically stressed, a human invention which detaches religion from its humanistic direction in order to transform it into an organ of power. Yet, they never identify fundamentalism with Islam. On the contrary, they often praise the influence of Islam on European civilization alongside Christianism and Judaism. In conclusion, According to the European law, the religious leaders are legally obliged to respect the peaceful coexistence of nationals, refugees and migrants in European societies, no matter their beliefs. If they don't, then the European legal order suspends its protection over their respective religious communities. Finally, the state authorities are obliged to contribute in parallel with the religious leaders to the peaceful coexistence of the different groups in a particular European society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I've already learned about the legal obligation. I think it's something that we may want to discuss afterwards, and how it ties also with the religious, not instinct, but as His Holiness said, it's a duty. So it's very interesting how this coincides. Let me turn to Peter Petkoff and hear your views, and we'll see how this ties together.
Thank you very much. Your Holiness, Your Eminence's distinguished guests, I would like to thank you and the organizers for, can you hear me now? And the organizers for having me.
Is it open? Yeah, a bit closer,
Okay,
closer, a bit
wonderful.
closer. Yeah.
Is this better now? Better? Wonderful, yeah. I'm glad to be back in the city, and I'm a lawyer, and I will speak about international law and foreign policy, and what difference does religion make in foreign policy, and in particular how the refugee crisis highlights this difference. The refugee crisis has highlighted a particular blind spot in international and regional cooperation, and the way international and international cooperation articulates belonging. It is a unique opportunity to articulate not only the obvious that religion is a factor for shaping a foreign policy, but also to articulate the ways in which religion could reshape a very important conversation between religious and non-religious legal and normative cultures. Long before the refugee crisis, the blind spot I highlighted was articulated by the political theologian Oliver O'Donovan in the following fashion. The proper form of universal humanity should take is not that of a home, but that of a meeting. The idea of a world government is inherently unfree, since it elevates non-reciprocity to be the ultimate form in which human beings confront one another. No community should ever be allowed to think of itself as universal. All communities, including the largest, should have to serve the end of equal, reciprocal relations between their own members and the members of other communities. One could put it in this way: it is essential to our humanity that there should always be foreigners, human beings from another community, who have an alternative way of organizing the task and privilege of being human, so that our imaginations are refreshed and our sense of cultural possibilities renewed. The imperialist argument that until foreigners are brought into relations of affinity within the cultural home, they are enemies, is simply creation of xenophobia. The act of recognition and welcome, which leaps across the divide between communities and finds on the other side another community which offers distinctive friendship of hospitality, is a fundamental form of human relating. The increasing footprint of religious actors in international law and in the context of international and regional cooperation is a very important way to calibrate and reverse the grammar of universal belonging, a grammar which dominates international and regional cooperation projects and articulates belonging demarcated along such universalist terms. In many ways, we are led to believe that the European project, as well as the project of international cooperation around the United Nations, is articulated in those universalist terms. Well, what difference would religious leaders make in this context? Well, I'm not a religious leader, so I won't be able to say so, but I'm an international lawyer, and as an international lawyer, speaking from the narthex, I could actually say that religious actors in the context of international law and international organizations are today more visible than they have ever been before. Their footprint in the context of the international organizations is significant, and for the first time in the history of the international organizations and the European Union since the creation of this international region and regional projects, institutions do actually listen to religious actors. Religious actors have developed a very sophisticated ways of engaging in an international context. Very often they follow the patterns and the examples of the Holy See and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Increasingly, organizations like the Russian Orthodox Church follow suit through the Russian delegations in an international context. And finally, the international community begins to recognize that religion is not something which is going to disappear in 25 years when we all become less religious and more secular, but in fact they begin to realize that the fact that policymakers and diplomats have not engaged with religion as factor of international policy has been a grave mistake. Authors like Tom Farr have articulated that such blind spots in the training of diplomats in the US State Department has actually led to missing a very important aspects of the role in religion in shaping society in the same way economics of security shape society, and these forms have to be studied, analyzed, and we should be able to measure and predict how religion makes a difference in a social and political context. And with this changing landscape about the impact of religious actors in international law and international organizations, the role of religious leaders may not only be an opportunity to change and reshape the grammar through which we engage with international organizations. This may, in the way we engage with the question of refugees, obviously changing the grammar through which we engage with the idea of refugee and the understanding that we are in some way refugees or strangers, would also help with a bigger project. And this bigger project is to find a way, the context and the audiences through which religious and non-religious cultures participate in a dialogue and engaging with one another. And in this context, religious normative cultures would increasingly attune themselves for the different audiences which international organizations and political community present, but it also attunes the political communities and international organizations to the perspectives and the angles of religious actors in this particular context, which is political, international, deeply contentious, but also pretty aware and attuned to the different religious organizations and religious cultures have and make an impact on the way international institutions think and articulate their perspectives on religion. So this dialogue of cultures is not simply a dialogue which shapes the way we think about religion. It also gives a more sophisticated and more articulate way through which we talk about the difference between religion and culture. This difference has been historically articulated through a false dichotomy in the context of international law. Religion has been seen as something different from culture. In fact, the greater impact on religion on international law may be an opportunity to recalibrate and reconsider this dichotomy more along the lines of Athens and Rome, the understanding of culture which is something deeply integrated, and it's very difficult to unpack in the way culture was understood in classical Athens, as opposed to civilization, which is represented by people bound by different people belonging to different cultures, but bound by the civic project of civilian law of Rome. And in such contexts, religion, in such different contexts, religion could play different role in societies which are shaped by an understanding of more integrated and interdependent culture, as opposed to a project shaped by civilizational, civic values-based model. And through the conversation between religious and non-religious normative culture, we may actually be able to understand that it will be inherent that in the model within which we still operate, which is the Rome model of civilian society, different cultures would participate in different ways, in different terms, even though we all may remain bound by the normative framework of civilian law. And the more intelligent and deeper this conversation is, the more sophisticated and inclusive the dialogue between religious and non-religious legal cultures will become. And in this context, the question of how we deal with refugees would be a subset of this broader conversation which urgently has to happen. And on this, I shall rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. But very also interesting, different perspective from the international law and relations. And I kept several points. I like, though, the one that also we think we discuss later, because as I said, this is a beginning of a process we're initiating today, is the recalibration of the dichotomy between culture and religion. That was a very thoughtful piece. So now I realize we move to a different culture or religion, and we have our in-house expert, Professor Marioras from Athens, to give us a bit the perspective from Islam and the Muslim view. And yes,
representatives of different religious dogma here in Istanbul, distinguished guests, thank you very much for the invitation. The title of my speech is Religious Leaders' Role in Religious Tolerance and Intolerance, the Case of Islam. One of the most severe difficulties concerning our discussion is the stereotypical, biased confrontation of Islam as responsible for all the violations of human rights, mainly the intolerant attitude in Islamic countries, as also for all the cruelties in the name of Allah all over the world. It is absolutely necessary to differentiate between the original, pure Islamic teachings and practices and the manipulated exploitation of Islam in order to fulfill multifarious interests. Misleading faction of Islam as legitimization of different goals, mostly personal and political, is in great extent responsible for the falsification of the pure essence of Islam. At this point, we should remark that every religious identity, and as a result religious attitude also, are shaped by concrete factors such as locus, ethnicity, social status, etc. So the relationship between Islam and tolerance is shaped by the economic, political and social circumstances in which it finds itself, and that it has no independent existence from these circumstances. As a result, we ought to approach Islam as a multidimensional and polyphonic complex. Economical, social and political parameters must be taken in consideration seriously in the ongoing discussion of every Islamic issue, because in reality they are not identified always, nor absolutely, Islam, religion, politics, society, etc. Consequently, similar approaches end to misunderstandings which are credited to Islam. Definitely, Muslim scholars play an important role as religious leaders also, which express their own background, as it is clear that contemporary Muslim opinions is far too divided to provide a basis for making general pronouncements regarding where Islam stands on rights. In this context, we must take also in consideration the local ethnic tradition and specificities which so many times impose extreme practices and cruelties under a so-called Islamic coverage. In other words, the aim is to defend the proposition that respect or disrespect for human rights is a matter of political will and choice, not of a cultural authentic essence which necessarily shapes and constrains societies. It is quite clear that in many cases the reaction of Muslims isn't religious, but it is caused by other very complicated political, social and historical reasons, as the Islamic tradition is but one factor among many that influence how Muslims react to people from different religions. Is it Islam compatible with democracy, as the discussion about tolerance and intolerance could develop only in democratic political structures and not in despotic regime? Is it possible for a Muslim to act and behave in a democratic frame, protecting and embracing every man's rights, independently of race, sex, religion, and other elements? In our opinion, the answer is yes, even if there are so many Muslim expressions and voices about these issues. In this context, Islamic democracy is something different from Western democracy, in which people act alone without any divine guidance, but differentiate also from theocracy, in which a few religious leaders decide for everyone and everything. As a consequence, only Allah has absolute rights and people just relative rights, which derives exclusively from their submission to His will. These human rights are conceived mainly as social duties within Islamic law. Relatively, only under this prism is possible to act religious leaders in Islam, and they are enforced to propagate the dignity of every single person as Allah's Khalifa. The Quranic acceptance of human dignity and equality of all human beings must be the starting point of religious leaders in Islam towards tolerance. Of course, the main demarcation in Islam between faithful and unfaithful can cause very serious problems in our discussion and severe limitations in religious freedom. In this context, the famous Quranic verse, "There shall be no compulsion in the religion," introduce in fact the religious freedom in Islam, accepting that it is not possible to enforce faith to people. As a result, religious diversity is acceptable because it is introduced by Allah Himself and in no way by human beings. Certainly, it is also well known that Muslims through time didn't follow this practice, but according to their interests, persecuted in so many cases people of a different religious faith who didn't embrace Islam and unleashed jihad against them. One strengthens even more religious tolerance toward the people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab, and do not argue with the people of the Scripture except in a way that is best except for those who commit injustice among them. And your God and our God and your God is one. Allah doesn't allow even to dispute with the people of the book, but allows simply conversation, enforcing in fact the peaceful coexistence and tolerance between people. However, it is the same Quran that mentions fight those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and His Messenger have made unlawful, and so on. This attitude strengthens hate and intolerance. In another example, Quran doesn't enforce any particular punishment for those who distanced more or less from Islam, but simply warning them through Muhammad. The truth is from your Lord. So whoever wills, let him believe, and whoever wills, let him disbelieve. It is abundantly clear that religious guidance is, in other words, given, propagated, and expounded, but it may not be enforced by anything other than sound and sincere advice. From the above-mentioned examples, it is quite clear that most of the problems occurs from the use or misuse and the interpretation or misinterpretation of religious apocalyptic texts, such as the Holy Quran, in accordance with the specificities of time and space. In any case, it is totally crucial the religious leaders' exegetical approach of particular citations, like the above mentioned, that indeed could dynamite the discussion and the forthcoming developments. Unfortunately, history, but also current reality, proves that so many times the religious leaders accentuate exactly these negative aspects. Each interpretation that the religious leaders choose enforce relative, concrete behaviors of the faithful that very easily could provoke negative or positive actions. That happens because there are many, sometimes contradictory readings of the Quran. This means that we are not really constrained by the text, even though it and the injunctions it contains cannot be set aside. Which interpretation we adopt is a matter of choice, not predetermined by the text itself. In our opinion, the crucial problem in Islam concerning religious tolerance and intolerance, and in general the discussion about human rights, derives from the accentuation of the Sharia as the key factor which regulates everything in this religion. Instead, the situation could be much better if the key factor were exclusively the theological teachings of the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet, and the practice of the first Muslims in Mecca era. These two sound Islamic sources, namely Quran and Sunnah, if they are properly elaborated by religious leaders and scholars, can introduce a more compatible and mild approach between Islam and West world, mainly the domain of tolerance between different faiths and religious freedom. We are convinced that all the major problems occur from the literary application of the Sharia in our world, which of course, under these particular circumstances, is fundamentalist and extremely radical without any flexibility. This radical and monocular approach serving perfectly the interests and the plans of certain unethical religious leaders and politicians diachronically. These insane people manage the absolute identification of the Sharia with the religion of Islam in general, without any boundaries or other parameters. Consequently, some extremely wrong, absurd, and unacceptable ideas and manipulative practices covered by the prestige and the authority of religious faith, Islam, provoke the well-known results of our days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very enlightening and informative presentation, and the context, I keep that it's a matter of choice, and you put all the hard questions and how we go, it's a matter of choice, and you attach really to this multidimensional and polymorphic, as you said, context. So thank you. I think that would be very helpful for our discussion later. And now I would like to ask dear academics, allow me the expression, our colleague and the feet on the ground, without indicating anything for academics that their feet are not on the ground. But we want to hear the breadth of the experience that Mr. Vingas carries and looking forward to make us. Thank you.
The evolving cultural identity in today's Turkey, indigenous, non-Muslim communities, and the newcomers. Your Holiness, distinguished religious leaders and diplomats, esteemed representatives of ICD and to DIKTIO, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this conference with such a timely issue as that of the role of religious clergies and the social integration of immigrants in the destination countries. An important source of knowledge for the social aspects of religion in the previous years has been my personal experience as a representative of the 166 minority institutions under the General Directorate of Foundations of Turkey. In this capacity, I had the opportunity to travel to 12 cities of Turkey, being in constant contact with these institutions and expressing their needs and desires for a greater role in social interaction. In the context of a modern global lifestyle and outlook, societies in the West face the challenge of integrating those immigrants who seek refuge for a new life. Today, the need to have immigrants integrated in our societies is inevitable. In most cases, our societies have already experienced the intercultural coexistence insight, since most national societies include various ethnic or religious communities. Thus, the role of various religious clergies is central in the process. Although we have not yet succeeded the full integration of the genuine local minority communities to the larger society, we hope that our enormous efforts will lead us to bridge this social and political gap. Having the experience of the Turkish society all these years in regard to the non-Muslim communities here, allow me to share with you our experience here and offer some hints about the foreseeable future. The non-Muslim communities of Turkey. With regard to the indigenous non-Muslim communities, it must be said that Turkey has always been on the lead of modernization of the Muslim world, and it was the first Muslim country which adopted a constitution in 1876. Since then, the Turkish constitution has been amended repeatedly in 1921, 24, 61, 82, and 95, in an effort to adjust the political life of the country to the needs of the society. Consisting of two parts, the Turkish constitution frames and ensures the balanced relation between the state and the citizens. Particularly in the second part of the constitution, defines the fundamental civil rights as these are globally accepted, as it is the equality of citizens, freedom of expression, property, and inviolability of the domicile. Additionally, Article 24 sets the legal framework for freedom of religion and conscience. As a matter of fact, what was prescribed theoretically in the law about the religious minorities was not observed and implemented, in fact, by the judiciary and the state. These used to be actually the norm in Turkish politics. That is why monotheistic religious minorities have been marginalized from the social and political life of Turkey in the last century. It was only a decade ago when the government acknowledged these inconsistencies in the enforcement of law and has gradually altered the former reality by dispensing justice and returning a part of the institution's properties to the non-Muslim communities. This is an important step to a modern and vigorous Turkish society of the future. Today, we are the first step of restoring the basic civil rights of these communities, involving the right to property, religious expression, liberty and security, and equal participation to the social developments in Turkey against discrimination. But more needs to be done in order to implement these prescriptions and develop new ones. The platform for achieving such a goal is the long-awaited adoption of a new constitution in Turkey. From this floor, we express our hope that the under formation new constitution of the Turkish Republic will ensure in practice, not just theory, the egalitarianism of monotheistic communities. It is indeed an important moment in the modern history of our country. It is the wish and expectation of all monotheistic communities that the adoption of the new constitution will enable us to enjoy our rights as equal citizens in a flourishing society. We want to see ourselves equal and free in every aspect of our personal and communal lives. In this framework, the reopening of the Ivros school after a half-century after its closure is an important step to the return of the Greek community of Ivros to the social foreground of the social life of the island and the country in general. The elimination of discrimination for religious reasons is, in the current era of globalization, a necessary precedent so that Turkey does not lose the pivotal role of mediator which is offered on the new geopolitical chessboard. Finally, leaving aside the theoretical issues of international politics, a new and dynamic role for the minority institutions would allow their members to take their places as full Turkish citizens in modern Turkish society without the subtle negative designation as minority. The elimination of this discrimination is a desideratum also for the social integration of a certain percentage of Muslim and Christian migrants coming from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries. In our days, Turkey is characterized for seeking a new role in the changing world order, being one of the regional powers. This is visible on increased foreign policy activism, military investments, and trade volume, especially with its surrounding regions. Meanwhile, Turkey's ambitions also include a soft power dimension operationalized as a combination of culture, political values, and foreign policy. The migrants. Acting as a bridge between Asia and Europe, Turkey will continue to face the critical challenge of migration. Millions of migrants from war-torn neighbor countries, as well as other areas with economic and climatologic instability, flee their motherland and enter Turkey. Considering the huge number of migrants, it must be stressed out that Turkey has performed enough well in various fields: the establishment of camps, rehabilitation centers, logistics, and security. However, Ankara has failed to tackle trafficking networks acting in the country and forwarding migrants westwards to the Aegean and Thrace. Much needs to be done in this case, and the recent agreement between EU and Turkey is expected to strengthen efforts in this regard. We all know that the vast majority of migrants wish to reach Europe, and thus there has been so far no need to develop an integration policy for them. Hence, the policy of the government has focused on the welcoming, holding temporarily the migrants, and providing everything that is necessary for their welfare during their presence. Taking in consideration the broader developments in Europe and the increasing influx of migrants coming from Asia, Turkey will need to act more systematically and effectively to address migration developments on its soil in the mid and long term. These developments are mainly three: the increasing numbers of migrants coming from the East, the returning migrants from Europe, and the stuck migrants in Turkey. As a result, a percentage of the migrants will and has already decided to stay, even temporarily, in Turkey. Then Ankara must form a domestic policy which will enable the social integration of these migrants here. The integration entails housing, jobs, education, social security, and everything that is necessary for the migrants to settle and live a normal life. Here, the role of the mainly Muslim and Christian clergies is crucial in terms of networking and social allegiance. The Christian refugees carries also on the fear of being a religious minority in their native land, as well as in the countries they temporarily have to leave until they reach their final destination. The century-old religious institutions of our region can initiate a new common plan for helping the migrants and providing security, shelter, and food during their Via Dolorosa way of suffering. Religious leaders could definitely encourage their members, parishes, organizations, and missions in Europe and European countries to take an active part in this human tragedy. The expectation and the needs of the people today is beyond any academic and theoretical initiative, which is not necessarily bringing an immediate solution to a vital and sustainable action plan. A peaceful coexistence of the societies should never be expected if there is no harmony, trust, engagement among different religious institutions. A committed cooperation of the clerics and political members will create the necessary framework for an effective modus operandi. Thus, our experience as religious minorities of Turkey can be really useful. We could also underline some local examples and praise the efforts of our non-Muslim institutions in Turkey, coordinated locally in Istanbul by the Syrian and Chaldean communities, and some other foundations in Mardin and Antioch. Some thought a democratic society based on drawing every aspect of spiritual inventory of its citizens, regardless of religion, ideology, and payments, is a steady and strong politically and economically dynamic society with a bright future. The society which offers expression, creativity, and work for its citizens highlights those very characteristics which guarantee safe and guide further development. Otherwise, the dynamics of society has an expiration date, leading it inevitably to decline and decay. The elimination of discrimination for religious reasons is, in the current era of globalization, a necessary precedent so that Turkey does not lose the pivotal role of mediator which is offered on the new geopolitical chessboard. Finally, a new dynamic role for the minority institutions and the migrants would allow their members to take their places as full citizens of modern Turkish society without the negative designation of minority. Today, despite the various obstacles and adversities, all monotheistic communities, along with incoming migrants, can contemplate the future with much optimism and hope. The process of demarginalization of non-Muslim communities in the social life of Turkey is a reference point for the policy that will be followed in the case of the incoming migrants. Ensuring multiculturalism, social harmony, creativity, economic and personal development based on cultural rivalry and respect for human rights, we will be able to ensure the integrity of our own society and mostly peace inside and outside the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. You gave us a very solid snapshot of what's going on and the opportunities and challenges of here from Turkey, but also I keep the nice, you touch upon the role of civil society within the context and the collaborative framework that religious leaders and politicians could help establish. So a lot of food for thought. Thank you all very much. I would like to ask if there are any questions. If not, I would like to, yes, you have a question? Thank you very much for your input. I omitted to mention that all of our discussion will be recorded. We will have proceedings of this symposium, so we will keep up the best points and start building upon these important conclusions that, or food for thought rather, that come from today's session. So thank you again, our city panelists. We will have a 5-minute break and for tea and coffee, and we will reconvene to truly listen now to our religious leaders' perspectives and views.